Enough time has now passed since the long-awaited release of Camellya, and it's fair to say that she has destroyed expectations in terms of performance, to the point where many players are even considering Camellya as the new best DPS character in the game. On the other hand, due to our Dragon Queen still dealing enough damage to obliterate pretty much anything in the game with ease, it could definitely be argued that Jinhsi is still in fact the best DPS in the game. So especially with Jinxi's rerun banner very likely dropping in the next version update, it would certainly be beneficial to some players to know which character would exactly provide more value. So with that, I'm gonna briefly go over some kit standouts for both Camellya and Jinhsi, the ease of rotations and combat performance, their flexibility in team building, and lastly, who between Camellya and Jinhsi holds more value overall. Just before we jump into it, as always, would really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel for more WutheringWaves content and drop a like if you enjoyed the video. Now, just as a refresher for Jinhsi's kit, Jinhsi is a Spectral Broadblade DPS and is currently the strongest burst damage dealer in the game. Similar to Camellya, Jinhsi has two different states, being her base state and the incarnation state, and whilst in this state, Jinhsi gains access to a new set of attacks that scale off resonant skill damage and will be able to attack enemies in mid-air. Once completing a full basic attack string in the incarnation state, Jinhsi is then able to activate the Illuminous Epiphany skill, which has its own unique animation and is in fact Jinhsi's highest damage dealing ability. At max level, the skill's burst damage has a damage multiplier of 347.92%, which isn't the most. However, then taking into consideration Jinhsi's incandescent stacks within her forte gauge, each stack provides an additional 44.54% damage multiplier, stacking up to a total of 50 stacks. So the Illuminous Epiphany Glamour's damage multiplier is capable of spiking up to a max of 2574.92%, which isn't always achievable since Jinhsi is reliant on allies to deal attribute damage in order to provide incandescent stacks. But with the right team, Jinhsi is able to consistently reach near enough max stacks, and so would allow her to deal massive amounts of burst damage. Additionally, once Jinhsi has unleashed the Illuminous Epiphany, the Unison buff will be activated, allowing Jinhsi to pop her outro skill and for the next resonator to activate their intro skill without consuming any concerto energy. So just considering how vital concerto energy is in combat, it means this unique ability holds immense value within Jinhsi's kit. Now, in terms of rotations and combat performance, Jinhsi is definitely one of the most easiest characters to play with and is certainly one of the more safest. Jinhsi only does become extremely effective once in the incarnation state, which is accessible through dealing a basic attack string and then resonant skill, or simply through her intro skill. After that, Jinhsi would activate the echo skill, then cast her resonant skill twice and deal one more basic attack string before unleashing her new cover resonant skill along with her liberation, which does in fact have the highest damage multiplier in the game out of every other liberation. With that, you would then switch out immediately to trigger off the Unison buff and would then switch her back in once you can activate her intro skill. So the rotation is pretty simple and can lead to a ton of damage being dealt. But especially since Jinhsi is dealing all of this whilst in mid-air, it does make it more difficult for certain enemies to reach her, and even more so if you do grapple to go up even higher. So you would more or less be untouchable in some instances and wouldn't even need to worry about dodging as you build up to deal 2 massive nukes onto the enemy. In regard to Jinhsi's team flexibility, as I mentioned, Jinhsi is reliant on allies dealing attribute damage in order to acquire stacks of incandescence. However, characters that deal coordinated attacks would be the most valuable alongside Jinhsi, as they provide double the amount of stacks per instance of attribute damage. So with that, there are a few candidates to play as Jinhsi sub DPS, such as Yinlin, Yuan Wu, or even Mortifi. But of course, the best would be Baizhi, as in addition of being capable of dealing coordinated attacks, she is able to increase resonant skill damage by 25% through her outro skill, which would naturally allow her to be Jinhsi's best sub DPS by far. Though with that in mind, it ultimately means any character that deals coordinated attacks would be able to synergize with Jinhsi and would qualify as a solid sub DPS. But depending on whether they can provide additional buffs just like Baizhi is able to, would be the difference between them being a solid sub DPS and a top tier sub DPS. So with that, Jinhsi is pretty flexible when it comes to team building, as there are quite a few options, including free-to-play options players would have access to, essentially allowing for Jinhsi to be easier enough to build around, with there being more premium options to provide a significant increase in damage. Now as for Camellya's kit, she does certainly share a few similarities with Jinhsi's, since Camellya does also have two states, being her base state and blossom state, and just like Jinhsi, Camellya will gain access to a new set of attacks that scale off basic attack damage, but more notably, she will be unable to move in this mode as she is lifted off the ground by her vines. That being said, she will still be able to dodge any incoming attacks and can use dodge to move in whichever direction in the air. In addition, a major aspect of Camellya's Blossom mode would be her Blazing Waltz heavy attack, which is a large AoE attack where Camellya continuously spins in place dealing great damage, but will also be able to parry literally any attack from whichever direction. So especially considering how often you can activate this heavy attack, it allows Camellya to not only feel fun to play with, but also incredibly easy to use in instances where you are required to parry. Now the most unique and valuable aspect of Camellya's kit would be the ephemeral skill, since it consumes Camellya's entire concerto gauge in exchange for her highest damage dealing ability, which deals significantly more damage than her liberation and has a damage multiplier of 1262.45%. Once unleashing the ephemeral attack, Camellya will then gain access to the budding mode and would proceed to activate Sweet Dream, which essentially provides Camellya with a ton of damage increase buffs. More specifically, the damage multiplier for both variations of basic attacks, resonant skills, and the dodge counter will be increased by 50%. Also, the Crimson Buds obtained from consuming Crimson Pistols will each provide an additional 5% increase, allowing for a total damage multiplier increase of 100%. So Camellya is a very self-sufficient character, as she is able to provide herself with quite a few buffs and gains additional concerto energy from burning through Crimson Pistols, allowing for Camellya to activate her Nuke of a Resonant skill quite often and to just overall be an amazing DPS. Now in terms of Camellya's rotation and combat performance, Camellya certainly is more difficult to learn at first than other characters, but is simple enough later on. Ideally, you would want to activate her intro skill, as then you would be able to obtain 100 Crimson Pistols. Then you would activate her skill to enter the Blossom mode and deal enough attacks consisting of basic attacks and heavy attacks to be able to activate the Ephemeral skill, which will deal a massive amount of damage and will allow Camellya to then enter the Budding mode, where you deal basic and heavy attacks till you have consumed all Crimson Pistols. Then you would exit the Blossom mode with the Resonant skill Floral Ravage and finally outro out. Now on paper and some instances in game, that is pretty straightforward and simple to pull off. However, considering that Camellya is vulnerable to be attacked throughout her entire rotation, it does mean there will certainly be interruptions. Specifically with the Blazing Waltz attack, it is able to parry any attack, but of course you are required to dodge any attacks you aren't able to parry, which will slow down the rotation. Additionally, Camellya's Ephemeral skill is prone to interruption as well, so after all of the build up towards unleashing the attack, Camellya can be knocked back, resulting in a massive DPS loss within the rotation. Of course that is fixed by her first sequence node, but that would require you to possibly spend an additional 150 tides, which isn't exactly something every player can afford. So with that, Camellya does hold a very fun playstyle, aka spin to win, but is a lot more reckless and vulnerable in taking damage, which would require you to be a lot more cautious when taking her into combat. Now as for Camellya's team flexibility, considering that she is a Havoc type DPS that mostly deals basic attack damage, there are essentially only two characters then that would provide valuable buffs to Camellya, being Sanhua and Danjin. Sanhua provides a massive 38% basic attack damage bonus through her outro, and Danjin provides 23% Havoc damage bonus. However, considering that both characters are 4 stars, with Sanhua especially being free for every player and Camellya's best option, it does allow for building Camellya's best team to be extremely easy in comparison to many other DPS characters. Though aside from that, Camellya doesn't have much flexibility in team building, given she requires a lot of field time and her damage specifically typically scales off basic attack damage. So until Camellya's dedicated sub DPS drops in the future, there won't be many characters that drop and will synergize well with Camellya. But considering how much value Sanhua holds and provides to Camellya, the lack of team flexibility really doesn't matter for Camellya as much as it would for other DPS characters. Now with everything considered between Camellya and Jinhsi, both characters are insane damage dealers and are certainly the best in the game. Though as for who holds more value, I would argue that Jinhsi still holds the title as the queen of DPS. But it could be very much different depending on the player. Jinhsi is more of a burst damage dealer and will deal majority of the entire rotation's damage through her resonant skill and liberation. Whereas with Camellya, her damage spans across the entire rotation through basic attacks, heavy attacks, the ephemeral attack and liberation. Which means there's more of a chance to be interrupted and for there to be a loss in DPS, and as I mentioned, Camellya will definitely be knocked back in certain situations, just like when casting the ephemeral attack. Though with Jinhsi, there is no chance of that happening as she is animation locked with both her resonant skill and liberation. Additionally, the fact that Jinhsi can hover above enemies and avoid attacks while she builds up towards activating the resonant skill simply allows Jinhsi to be much more easier to play with overall. Now that aside, the fact that there is technically more of a cost in building Jinhsi's best team is worth considering, as Jinhsi will require Zheji whereas Camellya will require Sanhua, which means you'll need to prepare to pull both Jinhsi and Zheji when their rerun banners drop. So in this instance, Camellya would hold more value over Jinhsi as she is utilizing a free character to deal insane levels of damage. Though that is until Camellya's 5-star dedicated partner drops, which has been rumored to drop in version 2.0. So Camellya's best team, whether you would like to upgrade or not, will then just be as expensive as Jinhsi's. But do take that with a grain of salt as nothing is confirmed. Overall, both characters are amazing DPS characters and each hold their own unique benefits, such as Camellya's ability to auto-parry consistently and Jinhsi's ease of use whilst dealing massive burst damage. So ultimately, it is really dependent on what traits from their kits hold more value to you as a player and your own preference in their design. As regardless of who you pick between these two, you will have a top tier DPS character able to clear all content. And with that, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Would really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel for more WutheringWaves content, and if you enjoyed the video, drop a like. Also drop a comment down below on who do you prefer between Jinhsi and Camellya. And yeah, hope to catch you guys later.